The wilderness stretched dry and endless. Dust clung to the prophet's robe as the brook beside him began to shrink. Each day, the water ran lower, and yet, no panic, no plan B, just waiting. Then came the ravens, black, winged, and unexpected. They arrived with bread and meat in their beaks, placing the portion gently near his feet before disappearing into the sky. No explanation, no delay, just obedience. No one sends ravens to deliver food. Ravens scavenge, they steal. They don't serve prophets, but that day they did. Because when heaven speaks, even unlikely messengers respond. Elijah had no map, no marketplace, no money. What he had was a word. Go to the brook. I have commanded the ravens. And somehow that word became enough. Thousands of years later, on the other side of the world, a young man stood in post-war Korea with no resources, no building, not even a proper pulpit. Only a vision in his heart. The city around him was broken. People were hungry for food, not sermons. The odds mocked every attempt. Yet the young man kept preaching, kept praying, kept seeing in the Spirit a church filled with people lifting their hands in worship, not just hundreds, but tens of thousands. That man's name was David Yonggi Cho. Faith, he once said, is acting on what can't yet be seen, but is believed to be real. Not vague hope, not fantasy, but a conviction strong enough to move feet, even when eyes see nothing. In time, the vision became reality. A church was born, then it multiplied, the largest in the world, all from a man who had nothing but a word, a man who refused to ask, "Who will help me?" and instead lived as though the answer had already come. When Elijah stood at the brook, the sky didn't open with thunder, but the ravens came. And when they did, logic lost its power. Only obedience remained. Because sometimes heaven's provision doesn't follow human rules. It doesn't always come through jobs, donors, or systems. Sometimes it rides on black wings and lands beside tired feet. And in those moments, the question isn't, how will this happen? But simply, is there still trust? In quiet spaces where nothing seems to move, provision is often already en route. Not from where one expects, but from where God commands. And somewhere between the rustle of wings and the breaking of bread, the atmosphere shifts. Not because circumstances change first, but because belief moves ahead of sight, just like it did in a desert with a prophet, and in a war-torn city with a young Korean pastor. Some messengers arrive without titles. Some answers come dressed as impossibility. But when faith listens, even ravens obey. The ark floated in silence. Above the waters, clouds still hung heavy, and the world lay buried beneath waves. No land in sight, no sound but water tapping against wood. Days stretched without answers, and hope felt as distant as the sky itself. Then wings, soft, white, weightless. A dove returned to Noah's hand, and in its beak, a single olive leaf. Just a leaf. Yet in that moment, it was everything. Not a tree, not a field, just a symbol, quiet, gentle. But it carried a message louder than thunder. The storm was ending. It didn't mean everything was ready. It meant everything was changing. In the early days of ministry, when buildings were scarce and prayer meetings were held in tents, Dr. David Yonggi Cho often spoke about shalom, the kind of peace that didn't depend on surroundings but descended from the Spirit. It wasn't merely the absence of conflict, it was the presence of order, of clarity, of alignment. Every great move of God, he taught, begins not with noise, but with an image, and every true image from God carries with it a deep peace. Not excitement, not fear, but stillness. So many visions stir emotion, but not all are rooted in the Spirit. There is a peace that surpasses understanding, and only it can confirm what the eyes cannot yet verify. When Noah received the olive leaf, he didn't rush to open the ark. He waited. Because peace is not a signal to move instantly. It is a signal to prepare. It doesn't shout. It steadies. It gathers scattered thoughts, stills anxious hearts, and marks the boundary between impulse and inspiration. And when that kind of peace fills the soul, decisions no longer feel pressured. Direction no longer feels blurred. There's no striving, no pushing, only alignment. The dove comes quietly. It doesn't come with flashing lights or dramatic signs. It comes after long waiting, when the heart has grown still enough to receive. And in that moment, the world doesn't need to change for everything to be different. Because something within has already shifted. The vision is no longer a wish. It becomes a knowing, and from that knowing comes boldness. Not the kind that fights, but the kind that walks forward without fear. Peace is not weakness. It is evidence that heaven has spoken, and the next season is already beginning to rise from beneath the waters. Some will miss it, looking for fire, but others will see the dove. Along the cracks of old stone, a line of movement barely noticeable wins its way. Dozens of tiny creatures, each carrying something bigger than themselves, grain, leaf, crumb. No one commands them. No applause waits at the finish. Still, they work. Not with panic, not with chaos, but with purpose. The ant doesn't wait for winter to begin saving. It doesn't wait for crisis to start building. Long before the season changes, it prepares, quietly, faithfully, without needing to be seen. It was this kind of discipline that Dr. David Yonggi Cho often described as essential to spiritual growth. Prayer, he said, was never meant to replace planning. It was meant to guide it. It wasn't an escape from strategy. It was the source of it. For some, faith becomes an excuse for delay. God will provide, they say, while the soil stays untilled. God will make a way, they repeat, but no steps are taken toward the path. But true faith, the kind that changes lives, always moves. It wakes early, it studies late. It prepares the vessel before the rain comes. It plans not because it doubts, but because it believes that when the door opens, readiness will matter. And that kind of readiness is not loud. It is not desperate. It is steady, focused, and built day by day like an ant gathering seed under the sun long before the cold. There is beauty in trusting, but there is power in trusting while working. Because sometimes the miracle isn't in what falls from the sky. It's in what's already in the hands, waiting to be multiplied. Not every breakthrough comes with a shout. Some come after months of quiet diligence. Some after choices that no one sees. Some after planning that seemed pointless until the door opened and all was ready. There is no conflict between faith and movement. The ant proves that. It listens not just to the need of today, but the wisdom of tomorrow. It stores, it builds, and when the season shifts, it is not caught off guard. It is already equipped. So while others run when the storm begins, the ant remains, not because of strength, but because of preparation. And in that stillness, strategy becomes visible. Not crafted from anxiety, but born from devotion. From the kind of prayer that doesn't just ask, but also listens and moves. Some say faith waits, but sometimes faith hustles. At dawn, when the streets are still quiet and the city hasn't yet awakened, a single sparrow hops across the edge of a sidewalk. Light as breath, quick as thought, it pecks at invisible crumbs. No fear, no hurry, no sense of lack. It trusts the day to feed it. No store, no bank, no calendar of promise. Only movement guided by instinct, or perhaps by something greater. In the years after the war, a young preacher in South Korea lay on a wooden floor each night with no mattress, no food, and barely enough strength to stand. The cold crept through the walls, and hunger gnawed without mercy. Still, each morning he stood in front of empty chairs and preached healing, breakthrough, and abundance. There were no crowds yet, no cameras, just quiet faith echoing into the air. "If I trusted what I saw," he once said, "I would have quit. But I trusted what I believed." David Yonggi Cho knew that sparrow kind of faith, the kind that sings before the seed appears, the kind that keeps showing up even when nothing seems to change. Faith that breathes in uncertainty and somehow exhales hope. Sparrows are not known for their beauty or strength. They carry no majestic wings like the eagle, no soaring presence like the dove. But in Scripture, they are remembered, known, counted, and treasured by the Creator. Not one falls without His notice. That kind of care changes everything. Because when the world reduces value to visibility, the sparrow reminds that worth is measured in the eyes of heaven, not applause. That unseen does not mean forgotten. That being small does not make one insignificant. And so, while others chase proof, the sparrow rests in provision. While others demand answers, it listens for rhythm. It does not stockpile like the ant. It does not plow like the ox. It simply trusts that what is needed will arrive when the time is right. And more often than not, it does. Not because of strategy, but because of stillness. Not because of control, but because of release. The sparrow survives because it never doubts its place in creation's plan. Faith like that doesn't argue with logic. It rises above it. And in quiet moments, when there's nothing left to hold, when the promise hasn't yet unfolded, when every visible sign seems absent, sometimes the sparrow appears, perched on a wire, dancing through branches, resting on a window ledge. Not to impress, not to teach, but to remind. Trust is not the absence of need. It is the presence of confidence in the one who sees even the smallest wing. The field doesn't applaud. It doesn't reward. It simply waits to be broken. And the ox, heavy and slow, leans into the soil, step by step, row by row. It doesn't ask for relief. It doesn't seek attention. It only pulls, steady, tireless, unnoticed. Its strength isn't in speed, it's in resolve. When storms pass, birds hide. When droughts come, insects vanish. But the ox keeps walking, even when the ground is hard, even when the harvest is months away. In the early years of South Korea's revival, as churches began to form under tents and tin roofs, one voice often echoed across the small cell groups. The strength of this movement, it said, is not in its preachers, but in its prayers. Dr. David Yonggi Cho believed deeply in the invisible work of faithful people. Those who never stood behind pulpits, never held microphones, but who kneeled in living rooms, prayed in back alleys, fasted quietly, and served without recognition. No spotlight, no nameplates, just intercession, just plowing spiritual ground when no one was watching. Faithfulness like that rarely feels heroic. It feels routine, but it shifts nations. The ox doesn't trample the harvest. It makes the harvest possible. Without it, the field remains untouched. With it, the soil yields fruit. And yet its reward is not always immediate. There are no applause breaks for consistency, no camera pans for discipline. But in heaven's economy, what's done in secret echoes louder than what's shouted in public. Faithfulness is a strange kind of strength, one that survives delay, endures silence, and keeps moving when others stop. It's the parent who prays at midnight, the leader who serves without thanks, the intercessor who no one remembers except God. When the ox plows, it does not ask how many are watching. It simply obeys the rhythm. And perhaps that is why heaven commands, "Do not muzzle the ox." Because there is power in the quiet labor. There is reward in the hidden place. And there is favor for those who keep walking, even when the field looks empty. Faith does not always feel like fire. Sometimes it feels like one more step through dry ground. And even when the seed hasn't broken, the ox knows this work is not in vain. Not every flower is sweet. Some sting. Some wither before they bloom. Some hold their nectar deep behind thorns. Yet the bee keeps gathering. With quiet persistence, it visits one after another. Not to complain, not to question, but to collect. Even from the bitter, even from the broken, it gathers what can be used. And somehow from this patient work, sweetness is born. Honey does not shout its process, it simply exists, golden, rich, and healing. The result of unseen labor in places no one notices. There were seasons in the life of Dr. David Yonggi Cho where pain lingered longer than hope. Criticism came louder than applause. Battles rose inside and out. The vision seemed distant, the weight too much. But in the middle of those silent struggles, something unexpected began to grow. Not defeat, but depth. He would later say, God doesn't waste pain, He transforms it. And in those low valleys, the clearest pictures from God would form, not despite the suffering, but through it. Revelation would come, not in noise, but in stillness. And what once felt like failure became the soil for something sacred. The bee teaches this quietly. It doesn't avoid discomfort, it enters it. Not recklessly, but redemptively. With every landing, it pulls life from what others might discard. In the same way, sorrow can become wisdom. Delay can become formation. Loss can prepare the heart for leadership that doesn't just preach, but understands. True sweetness, the kind that nourishes others, is often gathered through moments no one else would choose. And just as the bee works in community, so too is transformation multiplied in connection. One bee does not build a hive. It takes many, moving in unity, carrying their portion, believing in the collective miracle. The pain that isolates becomes a testimony that unites. So when life feels bitter, when the days sting and the heart grows tired, perhaps the invitation is not to escape, but to extract. To gather what can be turned into something that heals. Not quickly, but faithfully. Because the God who created bees did not just design them to survive, He created them to turn wilderness into sweetness. And perhaps deep within the sting, something golden is already beginning to form. In a quiet corner, away from footsteps and flashing lights, a cat sits, still, unbothered, watching. It doesn't rush. It doesn't react. It studies, waits, listens. When the world runs past in urgency, the cat remains where it is, choosing silence over chaos, observation over impulse. And when it moves with precision, never chasing shadows, never wasting energy. Discernment is like that. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It comes in the stillness between questions and answers, where emotion gives way to clarity. Dr. David Yonggi Cho often taught that before any major step, a picture must be formed in the spirit. Not an imagined desire, but a vision born from deep prayer. Don't move, he would say, without a picture from God. Stillness gives you that picture. It's easy to mistake urgency for leading. But not everything loud is divine. Not every opportunity is from heaven. And not every closed door is an attack. Spiritual discernment doesn't rely on noise. It listens to patterns. It reads the seasons. It senses the shift in atmosphere when something is not quite aligned, even when everything looks perfect. But that kind of discernment can't be rushed. It's cultivated in quiet spaces where thoughts settle and the spirit speaks without interruption. The cat reminds that waiting is not weakness, it is wisdom. To move too early is to miss timing. To speak too soon is to dilute impact. But to wait with awareness, with sensitivity, with surrender, is to act with heaven's rhythm. And in a world where opinions scream and choices press in from every direction, those who hear whispers become anchors. The ones who pause, who watch, who pray without noise and decide without fear. These are the ones who are not just reactive, but responsive, not led by trends, but guided by truth. True healing begins when movement flows from revelation, not reaction. When prayer doesn't just ask for answers, but listens for timing. And just as the cat waits before it leaps, discernment holds its posture until the moment is right. And then, with grace, it acts. Not all strength roars. Some strength is still. She was not supposed to be there. A woman, foreign by blood and by law, stepped into a space not meant for her. She cried out, not for herself, but for her daughter, and her voice pierced the silence. The disciples urged the teacher to send her away. Even he at first said nothing. Still, she stayed. Then came the words that would have crushed lesser hearts. "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." But she didn't flinch. She didn't walk away. Her reply was simple, bold, and unshaken. "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table." That moment shifted everything. Not because she was loud, not because she was entitled, but because she was unrelenting. Her faith wasn't polished, it was persistent. It didn't need the whole loaf. A crumb was enough. Dr. David Yonggi Cho often spoke of this kind of faith. Not fragile, not easily offended, not concerned with dignity or timing. "Faith is stubborn," he said, "not arrogant, not blind, but enduring. The kind that knocks and keeps knocking, that prays and keeps praying, that refuses to let go until something moves." In a world that gives up quickly, that grows weary when answers delay, this kind of faith stands out. Some leave the door when it's not opened right away. Others wait outside, hands clasped, hearts anchored, eyes fixed. Not because they are worthy, but because they believe the Master is good. And even crumbs from his table are filled with power. Healing came to that woman's house not through theology, but through tenacity. Her background didn't qualify her, her resilience did. And perhaps that's the kind of faith heaven watches for. Not just eloquence, not just tradition, but raw, real, refusing to give up kind of faith. The kind that waits by the table, even when nothing is offered yet. The kind that keeps showing up, keeps trusting, keeps whispering, "Even this is enough." Some prayers don't open doors immediately, but they open the heart. And when heaven sees a heart that won't let go, something always shifts. Maybe not on the surface, but always at the root. Faith that refuses to leave often finds what others miss. Because staying near the table, even without invitation, still keeps one in the path of mercy. The wind has a way of speaking, not with words, but with rhythm. It passes through trees, lifts petals into motion, and brushes against the skin like a whisper no one else hears. Some walk past it, others pause. In the quiet spaces of his early ministry, Dr. David Yonggi Cho would often find himself drawn to stillness, not because he had nothing to do, but because he had everything to discern. The noise of need, the pressure of people, the weight of vision, they could cloud the inner voice. But nature had a way of clearing it. A tree bending gently under the breeze, a bird circling once, then flying east, the color of light just before dusk. These were not decorations, they were signals. Because for those who learn to listen, creation doesn't stay silent. He would often say, "If you train your spirit to see, you will never again be blind to what God is saying." Not every message from heaven comes in dreams or prophecy. Some come in patterns, some in repetition, some in the peace that settles when a certain flower blooms at the right time, or when a leaf falls just as a question is whispered in prayer. The Spirit's language is not always linear. It is layered, symbolic, rooted in Scripture, but carried on the wind of awareness. Jesus once said, "Consider the lilies. Look at the birds." Not to admire their beauty, but to understand the order, the timing, the divine choreography in the ordinary. And so, under open skies, among chirping sparrows and rustling leaves, a deeper kind of clarity often arrived, not in bursts of information, but in impressions that lingered. Nature, after all, is the canvas of the Creator. Every branch, every breeze, every rhythm is brushed with intentionality. For some, these things seem random. But for the discerning, they confirm, they nudge, they align. Not every decision needs thunder. Some only need a tree to lean with the wind and remind the soul that direction is already unfolding. And when the eyes of the Spirit are trained, nothing feels wasted. Not the ant crossing the floor, not the crow calling from a distance, not even the silence between sounds. Because revelation doesn't always arrive in volume. Sometimes it appears in vision. And those who walk slowly enough to see will always hear what others miss. Sometimes heaven doesn't knock with thunder. Sometimes it taps softly, like wings brushing against silence, like a shadow passing just once outside the window, like a whisper too quiet to startle, but too persistent to ignore. A raven lands where no one expects food to come from. A sparrow dances on an empty rail, unbothered by lack. An ox leans into the earth again and again, though no harvest yet shows. The bee collects from bitter places and turns them into sweetness. Nearby, a cat watches, still and silent, waiting for the right moment. Beneath a cabinet, ants gather in secret, planning for days unseen. A dove carries a message of peace before any promise is fulfilled, and a dog, though rejected, stays close to the table, believing that even crumbs are enough. None of these creatures stand tall in Scripture. None of them part seas or call down fire. Yet each one, in its own quiet way, holds a message. A coded note from heaven for those willing to slow down and see. Dr. David Yonggi Cho once said, "God speaks loudly through quiet things." Not everything divine arrives in grandeur. Often, it's the ordinary that carries the extraordinary. Not because the moment is big, but because the meaning is hidden. And so, when a bird appears again and again, when a flower blooms at an unusual hour, when silence fills the room without warning, perhaps it's not just coincidence. Perhaps it's alignment. Perhaps it's God. Because the signs of breakthrough often arrive before the breakthrough itself. They walk ahead, preparing the soul, testing the eyes, inviting the heart to believe before it sees. And those who are ready, not with answers, but with attention, are the ones who receive. So if the ground still feels dry, if the door still looks closed, if the prayer still hangs unanswered, look again. Not at the noise, but at the quiet things, the small things, the signs. Because what looks like a raven may be provision. What sounds like a whisper may be instruction. What feels like delay may be divine preparation. Don't ignore what seems small. Your biggest miracle may be hiding in the ordinary. The breakthrough may already be here, and the only thing left is to notice.